basically everybody the same questions. And what I'm doing is I'm contrasting the different perspectives, for instance, of a billionaire venture capitalist to a climate scientist such as yourself to a Buddhist Rinpoche. And I'm trying to find new ways of presenting this information to people so that it's pretty obvious the contrasting perspectives of what's going on in the world today.
Sure.
So my first question is a general one, and it's how would you describe the present state of the planet?
Well, we're sort of on a precipice, or the precipice right now of, whether we are going to stay within a regime where, the planet and we can maintain a sustainable relationship with each other, or are we going to continue on the course that we're on right now, which for many reasons is not sustainable. Climate change, of course, being human-caused climate change, that is to say, being one of the primary reasons.
How would you describe the forces at play here? Because obviously there seems to be a dramatic polarization of perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, the forces at play at a very basic level are, the interests of the of civilization on the one hand, and the very narrow interests of a small number of players in the fossil fuel industry on the other hand. And it would seem that the decision would be obvious given that dynamic, and yet the fossil fuel industry, certain bad actors within the fossil fuel industry, front groups that they've hired, paid advocates for the fossil fuel industry, have sought to poison the larger public discourse over this issue, so that ironically, when the decision is essentially between the health of the planet and the wealth of a small number of players, we're still debating which path we should choose. And it's a testament to how effective those polluting interests have been in poisoning the discourse on this issue.
Well, what's mind-boggling is that they're obviously highly educated people. They have access to the top information.
Right.
How is it that they're not as concerned as people like yourself seem to be?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't honestly know the answer. I think there may be some cognitive dissonance. We certainly do have, people within, the corporate world who perhaps do have personality traits that some might call tending on sociopathic. There have been studies that demonstrate that. But I think in large part, we're dealing with good faith actors who have managed to convince themselves. They don't want to believe that what they're doing is a fundamental threat to the stability of the planet, to the world they leave behind for their own children and grandchildren. So they've probably tried to find some rationalization. And you can, if you're looking for it, you can find it, right? If you are looking for somebody with apparent scientific credentials, impressive sounding scientific credentials, who's willing to sell you a bill of goods when it comes to this issue, who's willing to defy what the scientists of the world have overwhelmingly said, that climate change is real, that it's caused by us, that it represents a threat. You can find impressively credentialed individuals who will be willing to tell you something very different. You can find cable news networks, or at least one cable news network that is perfectly comfortable in presenting an alternative reality where the laws of physics don't behave in the way that scientists understand them to behave. And so I think you can sort of trap yourself in a bubble of sort of self-reinforcing misinformation and disinformation. And I think in some cases that's what's going on. In other cases, I think we might be dealing with, individuals who honestly care more about their own short-term interest and that of their friends than the greater public good. And unfortunately, we've seen that before. We saw that with tobacco and human health. The tobacco industry knew decades ago that their product was killing people. And yet somehow high-level executives within the tobacco industry managed to rationalize a strategy, it's called the tobacco strategy, to seek to attack and discredit what the scientific community was saying. We have the same thing here when it comes to climate change. The main difference being we're not just talking about the health of individual human beings, we're talking about the health of the entire planet.
So how does that influence extend right to the highest levels of government? It's because I just did an interview with Gwynne Dyer. I'm sure you know who he is.
I do, yeah.
And he had mentioned that the Pentagon has already got plans for Fortress America. Britain's got Lifeboat Britain, because they're expecting that the temperature is going to go up possibly 4 to 6 degrees, which means that it'll be unlivable in the tropical zones. So there'll be mass climate migrations, and they're going to have to protect their borders. So if that level of government, bureaucracy, whatever the military is, as far as being separate from the government, if they are looking into this, why is the government not on the ball with it?
It's a great question. I mean, the reinsurance industry recognizes that this is one of the greatest threats that they face.
Right.
Our military, the national security community recognizes many of our leading national security experts. The head of the Navy's Pacific Command has gone on record that climate change is the greatest security threat we face in the decades ahead. ExxonMobil, interestingly enough, has built into their sort of future corporate planning a price on the emission of carbon that's even higher than the one that the Obama administration had specified a couple of years ago, something like $60 per ton. That's the damage that ExxonMobil accepts the emission of carbon is doing to the planet, $60 per each ton of carbon. And of course, we're emitting in the gigatons, billions of tons a year. So there's a disconnect, right? There's a disconnect between sort of what thoughtful, rational people have concluded based on a sober analysis of the science, of the data, and sort of the public relations campaign that, ExxonMobil, while accepting, in their own internal policies, the damage that the emission of carbon is doing to the planet, has also continued increasing in an increasingly surreptitious way, but has continued to fund a massive disinformation campaign aimed at convincing the public that the science of climate change is fraudulent, that there is no scientific consensus. And so you have, in some cases, corporate entities talking out of both sides of their corporate mouth. And then you have bad faith actors like the Koch brothers, who have poured tens of millions of dollars into a massive disinformation campaign to discredit the science of climate change, to attack the scientists themselves, including myself.
Right. I would like to get into that a little bit later, but I wanted to mention that they're just recently, in March 2014, there's news coming out that they've read 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a new record in modern history. Is that correct?
Yeah, last year we passed the 400 ppm level for the first time, we think, in millions of years. I mean, we broke that critical threshold. So that happened in May of last year. And so there's a seasonal cycle in CO2. It's what we call the breathing of the planet, with the, as vegetation blooms in the northern hemisphere spring and summer, and photosynthesis begins for that season, that vegetation starts drawing CO2 down out of the air. So typically we see a peak in CO2 concentrations in the late winter, early spring, and then they eventually go down as we get into fall. Actually, they peak during the summer, the boreal summer. And so what in the past, it turned out that during that seasonal cycle, we didn't breach the 400 ppm mark until May last year. It was the first time we'd ever done it. So that seasonal wiggle, for the first time, crossed that critical threshold for a brief period of time. Well, this year, we crossed the threshold several months earlier. It's now mid-March. And within a few years, that seasonal cycle will entirely be above 400 ppm as CO2 continues to climb. And pretty soon we will be talking, in a matter of decades, we'll be talking about breaching the 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. We're increasing at about 3 parts per million a year. So if you do the math, we're decades away from not 400 ppm being the threshold, but 450 ppm. And at 450 ppm, climate scientists are fairly certain that we will commit to a net warming of the planet of 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough warming so that we start to see some of the most dangerous and potentially irreversible impacts of climate change.
Well, one of the frustrating things about talking to scientists is that they can never be definitive, right? That's kind of one of the trademarks of your perspective.
Right.
And so I was going to ask
you.
We
lead with our uncertainty. We
right.
lead with what we don't know.
Right.
And then only if you listen to us for 10 minutes do we eventually tell you what we know. And it's the opposite of what any communications expert will tell you is an effective strategy for communicating information.
And it's terrible public relations because then it just sounds like there's nothing, there's no certainty, it sounds like, to the public. So, but does everybody generally agree that the temperature of the Earth is relative to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere?
That the temperature
of the Earth is relative. Does science agree that the temperature of the Earth is relative to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? Is that a general agreement across the board? Is that just known?
Oh yeah, I mean, 2 centuries ago, we knew that. Joseph Fourier, one of those early 1900s scientists that you see, his picture, he discovered the law of heat conduction. Much of our modern mathematical framework in physics, Fourier analysis, Fourier series, was Joseph Fourier. This was back in the early 1800s. Fourier knew about the greenhouse effect. We knew about the basic physics and chemistry here 2 centuries ago. We also know, and there's literally no dispute, no legitimate dispute anywhere that we are increasing the concentrations of these greenhouse gases. Like I said, we've now crossed the 400 ppm mark for what we believe is the first time in millions of years. That's not coincidental. And you can actually look at the isotopes of the carbon in the CO2 that's building up in the atmosphere, and it has the fingerprint of fossil fuel burning. We know that CO2 isn't coming from natural sources. It's coming from the human-caused burning of fossil fuels. So that's all you actually need to know. Basic physics and chemistry that's 2 centuries old. This isn't controversial science. It goes back farther than evolution. If you want to talk, controversy, this science goes even further back than Charles Darwin and the science of evolution, where there's similarly anti-scientific debates that continue today. And so what we wouldn't be able to explain, what scientists would be stumped by, would be if the planet were not warming up as a result of that. And of course, all the observations tell us that it is warming up, much as we expect it to, and that we've just seen the tip of the veritable iceberg. If we continue on this trajectory we're on, we will see 4, 5 degrees Celsius, 7, 8, 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of this century.
So how can you put a spin on that? I don't understand how anybody could have blinders on when your instruments don't lie.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, there's an old saying, I think it's sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, although I'm not sure it was actually him, that, it's very difficult to get a man to understand something that he's paid not to. And so there is this cognitive dissonance, or in some circles, this, what can only be described as an anti-scientific approach. And it's not logical. It can't be justified by, objective thought processes. It typically is ideological in nature. It's tribal. It's part, if you're part of a certain sort of, movement within the conservative sphere of our politics today, then part of your tribal identity is to not accept the science of climate change. Just like part of your tribal identity is to reject the evidence that our president was actually born in the United States. It's not rational, it's not logical, and yet it's very prevalent, and it's toxic, and it's dangerous. And as we were talking about before, there is this, self-reinforcing mechanism. There's this, echo chamber that now exists, whereby people who have that point of view trap themselves within inside a media bubble that simply reinforces their own misconceptions, their own preconceptions, their own biases. Like I said before, if you don't like, what the world's scientists have had to say, there's a whole cable network that you can watch that's happy to tell you something, an alternative reality, an alternative universe, unlike anything that modern science tells us of.
So what do you do with that? Like, how do you put a crack in that bubble?
Well, it's increasingly difficult, right? I mean, that's part of the problem with this issue, climate change, human-caused climate change. It's symptomatic of a deeper problem that I think we have now in our public discourse, a loss of good faith in our public discourse, in our political discourse. The fact that, unlike what, there's the famous adage of, Daniel P. Moynihan, the former senator from New York, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And people nowadays, in certain sectors of our population, think that they're entitled to their own facts when it comes to issues like climate change. And it's very difficult to have the worthy debate that we need to have. There's a worthy debate to be had about what we do to solve this problem. And there's room at the table for conservatives as well as progressives in formulating the policies that will help us deal with this problem. But there is no good faith debate to be had about whether the problem exists. And yet, we have, one of our two houses of Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, is led by Republican leadership on the Science Committee, the House of Representatives Science Committee. The leaders of the Science Committee do not accept what the scientific community actually has to say about climate change, or about evolution for that matter.
So you're saying, in a way, what you're kind of saying is that there's an influence, is that there's a religious, I wouldn't say spiritual, there's a religious influence on decision making, a very powerful religious perspective.
Yeah, ideological, I would call it, or the religion of the unfettered free market, if you like. Okay. The idea that all regulation is bad. I think that's part of the ideological framework of those who don't want to accept the science of climate change, because if you accept the science of climate change, if you accept that there are these very clear damages that are taking place now due to our emission of carbon into the atmosphere, then you are forced to accept the notion of market failure, because the free market clearly has not solved this problem by its own means. It forces you to accept the role of government regulation. If you're ideologically opposed to that, the only way out of it, unfortunately, seems to be to just pretend, plug your ears and pretend that it's not happening. And that's what we're seeing in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's what we're seeing, with the Koch brothers spending tens of millions of dollars primarying Republicans who express an enlightened view about this matter, like Bob Inglis, former conservative Republican congressman from South Carolina, who was primaried out of his seat because he accepted that climate change was a problem. I wish I had the answer. I mean, the answer, really, the solution to the larger problem is to find a way to restore good faith to our politics at a time when it appears to have disappeared, and it really is coming from one side of the ideological divide, the far right, the Tea Party, the Koch brothers funded conservative movement that simply views consensus as a four-letter word. They don't believe in sort of fact-driven, logic-driven solutions. They don't believe that government regulation can have any role in our policies, and that's very difficult. It's very difficult to have the tough discussions we need to have about how to solve this problem in that environment. One solution, of course, is to change that environment, is to find a way to elect representatives, politicians who will represent our interests, the public good, rather than the narrow interests of a few fossil fuel organizations and right-wing foundations that fund their campaigns.
Do you feel that President Obama is doing everything he could do towards that end?
Well, the president has engaged in a number of executive actions through the EPA's regulation of CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants and other incentives for clean energy. I think one can make a compelling argument that the president right now is doing just about everything he can do in the face of the intransigence that we have at the congressional level. In an environment where there's no possibility of passing comprehensive energy and climate legislation, because you've got a House of Representatives led by politicians who don't even accept that climate change is real. How can you have a meaningful policy discourse with them? So in that environment, the president is doing much of what he can do to try to do something about the problem. A lot of folks right now are viewing with great anticipation and anxiety, or awaiting the decision by the administration on the Keystone XL pipeline, because, of course, the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, by the way, most of the land leases are held by the Koch brothers, so they're the largest beneficiary if this is constructed. But who will lose out is us, because it will mean that we'll be taking all of that very dirty tar sands oil, which is far more energy intensive than just about any other source of energy, including other fossil fuel energy sources like coal. And we will be going in exactly the opposite direction of where we need to be going with our global carbon emissions.
So his decision on that pipeline will be very telling, I imagine, on his take on all this.
If he, as he said in his State of the Union address a couple of months back now, if he truly means, it means what he said about wanting to make sure that he doesn't have to look back, and explain to his children and grandchildren why we didn't act in time to do something about this problem, which is actually, I found, an almost identical quote that appeared in the epilogue of my book, and also in a New York Times editorial I had written shortly before then. I like to imagine that maybe he had even read the editorial when they were drafting that speech. If he really means what he said, then he cannot approve the Keystone XL pipeline, in my view.
Is it already too late for a significant loss of species, a significant change in temperature, a variable land of?
Well, interesting you asked that question. I have an article that's going to be out in the April issue of Scientific American addressing precisely that issue, and it's now online. And so it asks that specific question. Is it still possible for us, for example, to keep warming below that 2 degrees Celsius threshold? Now, climate change is already having damages. It's already damaging us with respect to health, human health, food security and water security, national security. It is costing the economy, by some estimates, at almost 1% of total global gross domestic product because of extreme climate and weather-related damages. So by some measures, climate change is already having doing great damage to us, to ecosystems, to our environment. So it's really a matter of extent. How far down that road are we willing to go? There really isn't one critical number. It's not like a cliff that we drop off. It's more like a down-sloping road that gets steeper and steeper downwards. And we want to take the first exit we can take. And if we miss the first exit, we still take the next exit. It isn't like... So in that sense, 2 degrees Celsius warming is probably as good a measure of where we really start to get into some very negative impacts across the board, with respect to the developed world, with respect to the the industrial world, with respect to the developing world, with respect to the tropics as well as the extratropics, the poles. If you look across the boards, the impacts of climate change start to become really negative based on assessments that have been done by scientists when you get beyond that 2 degrees Celsius warming. And we can still avoid that. We most likely have to keep CO2 levels substantially below 450 parts per million in the atmosphere to do that. And we'll be at that level in a few decades if we continue with business as usual. So what it tells us is that, yes, we can still avoid what might reasonably be defined as dangerous and potentially irreversible human-caused climate change, but there's a great urgency now. I mean, we really have to bring our emissions of carbon to a peak now and ramp them down, several percent a year. And if we construct the Keystone XL pipeline at a time when we need to be bringing them to a peak and then bringing them down, we're instead just increasing the rate of production of fossil fuels, taking us in exactly the opposite direction. So we're at a critical juncture. Yes, there is still time to prevent what we might call dangerous human impact on the climate, but there isn't a whole lot of time. And that window of opportunity will disappear quickly if we don't act now.
Well, climate change now is not a uniquely American phenomenon. I mean, Canada, the tar sands are in Canada. China and Russia are large oil producers. What's it going to take to change the mindset worldwide?
Well, at some level, we occupy a very important position in that discussion because, we in the Western world, us and some of our Western fellow nations, the industrial world has had the luxury of 2 centuries or more of access to cheap, dirty energy. And we know that it's been doing damage to our environment and to the planet. And that damage was not internalized into the cost structure. So basically, we had the luxury of 2 free centuries of access to cheap, dirty energy. And given that, how are we to tell the rest of the world, which is now growing a modern economy, that China, India, how do we have the moral authority to tell them that they shouldn't too be exploiting those cheap, dirty sources of energy if we're not willing to take the measures necessary to demonstrate that we're serious about this problem? We have a special obligation, and other Western nations have a special obligation given the legacy of this problem, given that we created this problem, and to some extent we are leaving it in the lap of the developing world and of future generations. And so there's both there's an inequity here. There's sort of this disaggregation between those nations, those individuals who created this problem, and those who are likely to suffer the most, which are future generations who had no part, at least in the legacy of creating this problem, and the non-developed world that in many respects is likely to suffer the most severe impacts of climate change, the most severe threat and risk, because they don't have the adaptive capacity that we have in the industrial world due to our greater wealth. And in fact, by some measures, the impacts will even hit earlier there. Even a little bit of warming in the tropics, it turns out, leads to a very sharp decrease in agricultural productivity. So, and if you're a low-lying tropical island nation, even current sea level is already a threat. And if we're talking about another meter of sea level rise, another 3 feet of sea level rise over the next century, then they will literally be submerged. And so there's an ethical issue here that has to do with this disaggregation, both intergenerationally and with respect to and regionally, as to who is causing the problem and who's going to be hurt the most by it.
So is geoengineering already taking place? Are they already injecting sulfur into the atmosphere, or is that just like the last resort solution?
Well, by some measure, we are engaged in a geoengineering experiment. We've been adding CO2 to the atmosphere and fundamentally changing the atmosphere and changing our climate. Now, the purists would argue that it isn't geoengineering because it was unintentional. And so geoengineering, technically speaking, is supposed to be the intentional intervention with Earth's climate system in some way, or the Earth system in some way. And so one of the ideas that's tossed around, and I don't think that, no, we haven't yet reached the point where there's any evidence that there are any rogue geoengineering projects taking place. But there are proof of concept studies that are already being pursued. There have been efforts to do at least a small-scale iron fertilization in the ocean to see if it influences the uptake of CO2. There's talk of doing other small-scale geoengineering experiments that would serve as proof of concept. I personally get very nervous with these so-called geoengineering approaches to dealing with climate change, and the idea being, well, we're warming the planet by increasing CO2, and if we won't somehow garner the will to stop doing that, that maybe we can offset that effect by doing something else, like putting particulates into the atmosphere like a large volcanic explosion does, which cools the planet for a few years. And so if we could do the equivalent of a Mount Pinatubo eruption, like the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption, if we could put that much material up into the stratosphere every 3 years, then that might be enough of a cooling effect to offset the warming of the increasing CO2. But it turns out that the footprint of that effect is not the opposite of the greenhouse gas footprint. In other words, in the global average, they could cancel out, but that would be at the expense of some regions cooling, other regions warming even faster. And we would likely dry out the continents even faster. And it would do nothing about the problem of ocean acidification. As we increase CO2, the other CO2 problem, as we sometimes call it, is that we are acidifying the ocean. And most of these geoengineering approaches will do nothing about that. But to me, the primary problem with geoengineering is the principle of unintended consequences. And sometimes when people ask me about it, I'll remind them of the song many of us grew up learning. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly, and she swallowed a spider to swallow the fly, right. And she swallowed a frog, and it goes on, and eventually she swallows a horse, right. and of course that kills her. Right. And so it wasn't the fly that killed her. It was her geoengineering solution to dealing with that fly that killed her.
Right. So how do you explain to people who are experiencing the worst winters in their memory that the Earth is warming? I mean, to people who don't understand this, it doesn't make sense, and it probably adds more confusion to their belief.
Well, the first thing I would say is that their memory isn't very good, or they just haven't been around long enough. I don't consider myself an old-timer yet, but I still remember those very cold winters in the 1970s. And all we had this last winter was an old-fashioned winter by the standards of a couple decades ago. We didn't set any records anywhere, despite all of the hype about how cold this winter was supposed to be. There isn't a single location in the U.S. And by the way, it was just the U.S. Europe was setting record heat, Alaska was setting record heat, and the Northern Hemisphere was actually quite warm on the whole over this entire past year. But because of a change in the pattern of the jet stream and the so-called polar vortex, we happened to get an old-fashioned winter that is uncommon now because we've warmed the globe so much. A winter that used to be common and used to happen, it used to happen every other year. It would be like this. Now we've gotten to the point where maybe once every 20 years you get a winter like this. And you know what? Even 100 years from now, there will still be a finite probability of seeing a cold winter like the winter we just saw. But if we continue with business as usual, the globe will be 7, 8, 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and the ice caps will be gone in that scenario. The Arctic ice cap will be gone. Sea level will have risen maybe a meter by the end of the century if we continue with business as usual. And I can promise you, after all that has happened, after major cities and low-lying island nations have been submerged and there's no sea ice in the Arctic anymore, and the typical summer day in the Midwestern U.S. Is as warm as the all-time record warmest day is right now, you will still be able to find individuals willing to dismiss that any of that has to do with human-caused climate change.
So how do you deal with that personally? How do you deal with it, the fact that in a way you're dealing with an insane world? From your understanding, we're heading towards destruction. And how do you deal with that personally?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I like to think that, we've been there before. I mean, it's not that different from what we saw with tobacco. It's not that different with what we saw with ozone depletion or acid rain. These are problems that emerged fairly early on, and scientists identified the problems. The tobacco industry knew back in the 1950s that their product was killing people, but it wasn't until the 1980s, the 1990s that we actually got serious about policies to deal with that. So, that's 40 years, 30 years, 40 years later. The problem here, and so there were a great number of lives lost because of that procrastination, not acting as early as we should have. And I imagine that we're faced with something similar here. We haven't acted as quickly as we should have. Often it takes some catastrophic event when it comes to, pollution, water and air pollution. It was the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catching on fire in the 1970s that sort of suddenly woke us up to the fact that there was a problem when it came to the way we were polluting our water and air. And, so at some level, it may take a Cuyahoga River moment in the climate change debate before we see serious action. Now, some of us feel like we've seen that already. Hurricane Sandy, some of the impacts of Hurricane Sandy, we can say with some degree of confidence, were made worse by climate change. If nothing else, that historic coastal surge, coastal flooding surge at Battery Park in New York was at least a foot higher than it would have been because of global sea level rise.
And Britain's had similar.
What's that?
And Britain had some similar events, right?
Oh, Britain had record flooding, and if you talk to scientists who do so-called attribution, where they run climate models and they compare with the weather patterns produced in the climate models, and they can sort of do a before and after. What does the model say if we hadn't added greenhouse gases, and what does it say if we had? And you can show that the event, the flooding event that we saw this year in Europe or a few years earlier, was extremely unlikely to have happened in the absence of global warming. Does that prove beyond a reasonable doubt at a sort of courtroom conviction level of certainty that climate change was the culprit? That's not the way it works. You can't prove a single event was caused by climate change, but you can say in a probabilistic sense that it was much more likely to happen because of climate change, and the fact that these events are happening as frequently as they are and with greater intensity, that is because of climate change. Yeah, I mean, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change. We are feeling it in our daily lives. It isn't just an abstract, issue that affects polar bears in the Arctic. It's influencing us right now here in the U.S., in Europe, and around the world.
What needs to happen? Do more scientists need to get political? I mean,
well, the point of my New York Times op-ed a couple months ago was that we, the title of it was "If you see something, say something," which is borrowed from the Department of Homeland Security. We as scientists are citizens, and we see something. We see an actionable threat, and that actionable threat is human-caused climate change. And in my view, we have an ethical obligation to speak out. It doesn't mean every scientist has to do that. That all scientists need to be, that's part of their job description. But as a community, we need to make sure that that we are communicating what the science has to say. Doesn't mean that we're trying to mandate what the policy should be. I personally don't think that that's necessarily the responsibility of the scientists, but that we do have to make sure that the policy debate is informed by a sober assessment of what the science has to say about the reality of the problem, about the cause of the problem, and about the risks that we face if we don't do something about it.
Well, why shouldn't a scientist mandate that? I mean, why is it that businessmen and corporate lawyers who are running the world, why do they represent the decision-making process?
Well, no, you're right. The decision-making process should be, the decisions should be made by the people as represented in good faith by their elected officials. That's the way our democracy is supposed to function. Right. When the playing field, when the deck has been stacked and the playing field isn't level, and you've got the Koch brothers spending tens of millions of dollars defeating candidates who are trying to represent the interests of the people they represent, so that they can replace them with politicians who are in the hip pocket of the polluting interests, then obviously that is in violation of the assumptions that the founding fathers made in how our democracy was supposed to function. So the fact is that if we have politicians who are representing our interests, which is a big if, in that scenario, I'm comfortable in them deciding, what is the best vehicle. Talking with the economists as well as the scientists. If we accept what the science has to say, that we have to limit our CO2, limit CO2 concentrations, bring down our carbon emissions. What's the best vehicle for doing that? A carbon tax or tradable emissions permits, cap and trade, or fee and dividend. What's the best vehicle for doing that? I'm comfortable in politicians representing, if they're representing their citizens, the people they represent in good faith, just making that decision in consultation with the economists and the scientists and everyone else who has something to say about the matter. But what I'm not comfortable with is the notion that politicians can defy the evidence, can stand in contradiction to what the scientists are telling us about the evidence that this is happening and about the risks that it poses. So when I say that it isn't necessarily our role to mandate the policies, I don't feel like I need to be the one to decide what's a better vehicle for regulating carbon emissions, carbon tax or cap and trade. I'm comfortable in others, making that decision in good faith. But whatever vehicle, first of all, whatever we do has to recognize the risks and the costs that climate change is having, the need to stabilize CO2 concentrations, and the science clearly indicates that. The scientific evidence alone and the studies of impacts demonstrates, the level of risk that we are engaging in if we don't, stabilize CO2 concentrations. How we do that, that's up to our politicians representing the interests of the people that they represent. Yeah.
Well, that's a brilliant concept, but in your lifetime, have you ever felt that your government truly represented? Well, this is the closed loop, isn't it? Is that they do represent the people, but they keep the people somewhat ignorant, it seems to me.
Well, that's right.
So
that's right.
So where
they hand select the politicians whose campaigns they want to finance, and they engage in massive disinformation campaigns to fool the public into voting for the candidates who are not going to represent their interests, but are instead going to represent the polluting interests that fund their campaigns. That's the problem. That's the toxicity that we have right now in our politics. That is the problem that we need to solve in general to solve the specific problem of climate change.
Well, it's not even just climate change. Climate change is one dynamic of the human conflict that is represented in every aspect of our life, is it not?
Absolutely.
And that's what this project is exploring too. You're a climate scientist and that's your focus, but I'm speaking with people who are talking about different aspects of the human condition, which is just as unpromising as the climate future?
Well, I continue to maintain that the problem right now in in our inability to confront the climate change crisis is symptomatic of a much greater problem, as you're alluding to, which is the poisonous nature of our public discourse, the way that our public discourse has been hijacked by special interests who don't have the greater public good in mind. They're focused specifically on their bottom line and those of their friends, and in maximizing their own short-term profits at the expense of the greater public good. That is the problem.
So so in a way, it comes down to the individual, does it not?
The individual and collective, collective decisions by individuals that serve to ensure that we are being represented, well, that our interests are being represented in our politics, and right now they're not.
Yeah. Well, this, like I say, this project is exploring many avenues with this same core issue, which is humanity. What are we doing? We're supposedly the conscious species on this planet, and we're the only species that's actually destroying everything around us, including ourselves. So the spiritual point of view, I interview Buddhist Rinpoches. Standard religions are just spiritual beliefs, whether it's shamanic, and their point of view is that this whole thing is a way for us to internalize and to self-reflect, because the only way that they say real change is going to happen is from within, and then we reflect that out into the world. What's your thoughts on that? Do you have a spiritual bent? I'm not saying necessarily religious, but you're obviously self-reflective. You're not affected by disinformation, so you have a sense of self. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, there is a sort of a spirituality that I think underlies some of the values that we have as scientists, and we shouldn't pretend that we don't have values. And my colleague, the late great Steve Schneider, he was a great scientist, but he was a very effective communicator of science, and specifically about the problem of climate change. And he used to point out that it's important when we go beyond the scientific sphere and we start talking about the policy implications of the science, to make it clear that yes, we are people, we scientists are citizens just like everyone else. Right. Our views on the matter are informed by a great degree of familiarity with the underlying science that informs our viewpoints. But we have viewpoints, we have opinions, we have values like anyone else, and as long as we're upfront about what those values are, there is absolutely nothing wrong in communicating what we think the implications are of the science. In my case, I value, and if you want to call it a religious or spiritual, I don't really care, but I have fundamental values that have to do with just my perception of our place both in this planet and in the universe. That there are certain fundamental principles that they're self-evident. The fact that we owe an obligation to our children and grandchildren to leave the world, at least as good and hopefully a better place than we inherited. That's fundamentally true. I accept that is a fundamental tenet that we should live by. It's a fundamental tenet, at least that I live by. Those are my values. That we want to make sure that we leave behind a better world for our children and grandchildren. We want to be fair to our fellow human being. To cause great suffering elsewhere in the world, simply to further our own, individual consumption. I think that's wrong. I think that we do have an obligation to our fellow human being to try to make the world a better place, not just make our homes a better place, or our communities a better place, or our state a better place, or our country a better place, but to try to make the world a better place. To me, those are fundamental values that I hold, and my view on the matter of climate change is certainly informed by those values. It doesn't influence the way I do the science that I do. It doesn't influence the answers I get in my scientific calculations, but it does have an influence on the way I view the implications of the science that I do and the science that my colleagues do. So I do think that there is a place for reflectiveness and spirituality and values, and being upfront about what our values are. And if somebody else has different values, then let them express those values and let them try to convince convince us that their viewpoints are it should be heeded. But I think that the values of wanting to leave the better, our world a better place for our children, grandchildren, and wanting to make the world a better place overall. I think those are pretty compelling values to hold, and I think that they imply, if you accept that value framework, then it's clear that we have an ethical obligation to act on this problem now, and that's where I come from.
Awesome, that was great. Because that's one thing I'm trying to get out of people as well. Because I'm trying to contrast not just the dogma that everybody has. Because I mean, the venture capitalist has got his dogma, the religious guy's got his dogma, the scientist has their dogma. But when it comes down to it, it's survival here, right? And this could be paradise, right? Like, why aren't we making this paradise? We're conscious beings.
Right.
So I'm trying to find that value. I'm actually, that's one of my questions is what do you value? Why do you wake up in the morning and
Right.
Kevin O'Leary said that he wants to go to sleep richer than he woke up. That's his mantra, right?
Right.
And he represents millions of people. His YouTube interview has got a lot of people that just love him, right? So but what I want to do in this project is to contrast what the world means to him, what the world means to someone like yourself, what the world means to someone else. Just to provide more ways of making people more aware of perspectives on the planet, because it's tough like I say, it's tough to change people's minds, isn't it?
No, it is, and I think it's a great way of sort of framing the issue. It's let those folks, if they hold those values and believe that is the prism of values through which we should formulate our policies, let them make that case to the people honestly and openly.
Right.
And then let others who have a different viewpoint about our role in the world, our obligation to future generations, let them make their argument, and let's have a fair and honest discussion rather than this, very misleading discourse that we currently suffer from, where a few well-heeled interests can bombard the airwaves with misleading, often factually false,
Right.
Propagandistic misinformation, and skew the debate, and such that the public is not being given a fair choice between honest, differing points of view. My feeling is, when I was growing up, I feel like there was an intellectual honesty that existed within the conservative movement, within the Republican Party, that is increasingly difficult to find, and that's part of the problem. And one hope that I have, and I think there's some evidence that it's happening, a sort of splintering within the conservative movement, where sort of the moderate, fact-driven, logic-driven conservatives, I think, are becoming increasingly uncomfortable and being lumped in with the dogmatic, anti-scientific, sort of Tea Party type conservatives that exist within their party, and I think that cleavage may end up producing a coalition that can actually move forward in solving some of these problems. Let's hope.
It's either that or civil war, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and we certainly, ultimately, we would like to see problems solved in the absence of conflict.
Yeah.
And one thing we know about climate change, you can ask the leaders of the national security community, and they'll tell you the greatest threat to conflict and national security is climate change because of the increasing tensions that it will create between the developed world and the industrial world, between those who have resources and those who don't. So let's solve this problem in a way that minimizes unnecessary conflict, right?
Yeah, Gwendar was mentioning that's what he was saying, is that for countries that share fresh water, like Pakistan and India, and nuclear countries, when it starts drying up and somebody turns off the tap before it gets to India or Pakistan, right, there's going to be a major conflict.
Well, a compelling argument has actually been made that the Arab Spring, fundamentally at its root, had severe weather, extreme weather, and drought and climate-related circumstances as one of its core causes. So there's already evidence that climate change, that climate-related disasters and stresses are creating unrest. And again, it's sort of the tip of the iceberg. If we continue down that road, what we've seen thus far is nothing compared to what we will see.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was good talking with you.
Good talking to you too. Okay.
All right.